Good morning, DawgNation. This is Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. And I was talking to some of the folks that work with us off the air in our program. We were talking about how this is the 568th time we've done DawgNation Daily. And over the course of 568 shows, we've talked about just about everything that can be talked about when it comes to Georgia football. But today, for the very first time, we do DawgNation Daily with the Georgia Bulldogs reigning supreme as the #1 team in the country. I got to tell you, it feels pretty good. We'll talk more about it right now as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, if this is what rat poison tastes like, I have to say, it tastes pretty good. Pretty happy with it. Georgia, the #1 team in the country, at least according to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. Their first rankings for the 2017 season came out last night. And if you really look back on the last few days for Georgia, there has been a lot of winning and a lot of good news to talk about. Whether it be clobbering Florida 42-7, beating them so bad they fired their coach the very next day, and sort of watching the disarray that exists down in Gainesville since then. Adding to that the #1 ranking last night, also peppering in all the recruiting wins for Georgia. This is almost more good news than one Georgia fan can stand. And yes, I know what you're going to say in response to this. Hey, keep chopping wood. You know, don't worry about that. Don't pay any attention to that. Don't focus in on any of that kind of stuff. And listen, for a moment, if you don't mind, I want to be very philosophical. Now, I'll try not to do this for very long. But there is something that I do feel like kind of has to be said here. That if we're honest about Georgia and what we saw last night, the issue with Georgia being #1 is not so much an issue for the team and the coaches. They got that stuff taken care of, right? I mean, do you think Kirby Smart's going to let them buy into this even for a minute? Of course he's not. And, you know, as Kirby said this week, it's the leadership council that takes care of this stuff. You think Lorenzo Carter and Sony Michel, you think they're going to let these freshmen and sophomores strut around with, like, you know, #1 T-shirts or something like that? No, they're not going to do that. This is not an issue for the coaches and players. I really don't think so, no matter what. I mean, this is not going to be a problem for them. If we're really honest here on DawgNation Daily, on this program, we try to be. We try to be sort of an unvarnished, filtered look at what's happening around the program from the perspective of Georgia fans. If we're really honest here, #1 in the country is not so much a problem for the coaches and players as it is for the fans. There is an issue that comes up when you see your team, when I see my team, the team that I've followed my entire life, listed as the #1 team in the country from the College Football Playoff Selection Committee's perspective last night. And part of this is based on the past. The last time Georgia was #1, 2008, it certainly didn't end very well, and it was kind of, you know, brought to its knees there pretty quickly on that. And it's also this thought of, you know, when Georgia eventually loses, or if Georgia were to eventually lose, being #1 in the country is just going to sting that much more. You know, the fact that Georgia rose this high, if it eventually comes to an end, it's obviously just going to hurt that much worse. That's just sort of the fans' dilemma here. The more engaged you get with a team, and listen, I talk to Georgia fans every day, whether it be in the comment section on this show, be it the audio folks who respond later, the video folks who respond right there in the moment, people on Twitter, people just face-to-face when, you know, I'm walking the streets. There is an incredible level of engagement with Georgia fans with this team right now. And how could you not? The team has been just so much fun to watch. And every single moment, every single game sort of has its own storyline, and people just get wrapped up more and more in what's going on with the team. But the trade-off for that is the pain of the eventual letdown, if it were to come. And there's no reason to believe that it necessarily will come in 2017. But if it were to come, it's going to be that much worse because Georgia was ranked #1 in the country. So can we at least be honest about this, that when people sort of push back on the notion of Georgia being #1, hey, keep chopping wood, focus on South Carolina, no let up, no let down. This isn't so much from the fans' perspective about what they hope the coaches and players would do. It's almost more of a hedge, an emotional hedge, if you will, about just how much weight and significance is added to your shoulders when you think about being a fan of the #1 team in the country. But the truth is, you know, as fans, I think DawgNation ought to embrace this thing. And as I said a moment ago to start the show, I mean, wasn't it exciting last night? I mean, when you're watching that show on ESPN, if you were, and I wasn't watching it live, I recorded it and came back and watched it after the trick-or-treat festivities were over. So I'm, sitting there and watching Reese Davis kind of run point on this deal, and, they're listing the teams, and they kind of go 25 towards the top. And then when they get to final 6, they started going 1 down to the bottom. And they sort of casually dropped in Georgia at number 1. Now, I thought there was a decent chance Georgia might be number 1, just based on how the committee's behaved in the past. But still, when you see that graphic pop up on the screen, that big black G with that red background listed next to the number 1 team in the country, I mean, what was your initial response when you saw that? It had to be positive. It had to be good. And yes, people are going to say, oh, Alabama's in the best position because they're not number 1. They get to stay humble and hungry. Georgia's going to have the target on its back. So be it. That's fine. I think Kirby Smart and this Georgia team is more than fine with having the target on its back. And as Kirby Ocutt, the selection committee chairman, also by day the Texas Tech athletic director, as he explained last night, when you look side by side at Georgia and Alabama, there may be a debate, but the committee, I believe, picked the right team. Here's what Ocutt said about that.
We spent considerable time yesterday talking about the differences between Georgia and Alabama. We began our day this morning. We ended our day today with great debate, as passionate debate as I've seen. At the end of the day, it was the 2 wins against CFP top 25 teams for Georgia, especially the win over number 3 Notre Dame gave Georgia the very slight edge over Alabama this week.
So listen, maybe this is the wrong attitude, maybe this is the wrong perspective, but I say bring it on. I can't promise you that Georgia's going to finish number 1 at the end of the year. I can't promise you that Georgia, if it plays Alabama's undefeated team in the SEC championship game, it's going to win that game. Obviously, Alabama is a very good team, good enough to be kind of a unanimous number 2 from the perspective of the selection committee last night. I can't promise you how this thing's going to end, but I like the idea of Georgia having that 1 next to its name right now. I don't mind the idea of Georgia having a target on its back moving forward. I mean, when you play as well as Georgia has played through these first 8 games, that's just some of the attention that's going to come Georgia's way. And I think fans, to the extent that it's possible, ought to embrace this and get ready to enjoy it. Not that it's going to be easy. There's still a lot of football left to play. And, if you watched that selection committee show last night, you also get an indication of that. That while the debate may be between Georgia and Alabama, the 2 SEC teams 1 and 2, and who's better, who's more deserving, and the showdown that would seem to be on its way for these 2 teams to play in December in Atlanta, as Kirk Herbstreit reminded us last night, there's another SEC team parked at number 14 right now with just 2 losses who still thinks it could be in this conversation. And if you're a Georgia fan and you're worried about the hype and the attention of being number 1, you want to keep chopping wood. You obviously probably enjoyed what Kirk Herbstreit reminded all of DawgNation last night about a team that Georgia still has to play. Here's Herbstreit talking about how dangerous Auburn might still be.
Everybody wants to talk, especially Chris Felica, the Bear, about these 2-loss potential teams at the end, maybe having a shot for this year for the first time, having a shot to get into the 4. How about Auburn? With what they have in front of them, the big game with Georgia that everyone's almost assuming that we're already talking about, okay, Georgia, Alabama, undefeated in Atlanta. What happens if Georgia loses a close game? Auburn's sitting there saying, aren't they come to Jordan-Hare? I mean, we still get to play them, right? So Auburn, if they somehow were able to knock off Georgia and Alabama, sitting there with 2 losses, I think Auburn is still a team that's thinking about trying to surprise some people, and they're definitely in striking distance if they're able to get a couple big wins late in the year.
So real quickly from me, kind of a good news, bad news situation. The good news is, if you're afraid about Georgia getting too much hype, being number 1 and the proverbial rat poison that Nick Saban talked about a few weeks ago, Kirk Herbstreit actually helps you out a little bit right there. And I think Las Vegas and the online sports books are going to help you even more because they're going to make Auburn a point spread favorite when Georgia plays in 2 weeks. Yes, I know Georgia's still going to take care of South Carolina this Saturday. We'll have more on that in a moment. But when you look ahead to Auburn 2 weeks from now, no matter what the selection committee says, Vegas is going to make Auburn a point spread favorite over Georgia. So you got everybody in the country still saying that Auburn's a tough game for Georgia, and it is. And so if you're worried about too much attention, too much praise, too many pats on the back, the media, the betting public, and everybody else going to kind of help you out in that regard in a couple of weeks when it comes to the Auburn game. You see some examples of that right there. But the bad news, to kind of go back to what I was saying before, is there's nothing that any of us can do about the emotional roller coaster we're about to go on from here. Yes, the fact that Georgia has risen to the top of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee poll makes this one way or another, a month or two coming up that we'll all remember for the rest of our lives. And it is going to sting so bad if Georgia doesn't finish there. It just is. It's going to be awful. But that's the agreement we sort of enter into as fans to begin with, that we get deeply engaged with something knowing that success and happiness is going to be incredibly enjoyable and the opposite is going to be incredibly painful. But the truth is, when it comes to Georgia and its place in the 2017 season and whatever happens from here, I wouldn't want it any other way than the way that it is right now. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans of the number one team in the country, by the way. Thanks so much for being with us here on Facebook Live. Of course, you can watch us every Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. on the DawgNation Facebook page. We're on the radio at noon every day in Athens, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, the capital city, if you will, of the number one team in the country. And, of course, in podcast form, wherever podcasts can be found. We'll post the show for you at the world-famous DawgNation.com or on iTunes or on SoundCloud. We try to make the show as easy for you to find as we possibly can. And Georgia, of course, still riding high from its 42-7 victory over the Florida Gators this past Saturday. And while we look back to last Saturday, we also look ahead a little bit as well. 361 days from right now, we'll do it all over again. Florida's going to find themselves a coach. And next year in Jacksonville in 2018, Kirby Smart and George are going to go back down there and make him regret taking that job. At least that's what I think might happen. We'll find out more 361 days for him right now. And of course, when we look back on the trip to Jacksonville, one of the things we think about was our DawgNation invasion to Jacksonville, brought to you in part by our friends at Marlowe's Tavern. Now, you know I love Marlowe's Tavern. I know y'all do as well. You've been with us for some of our DawgNation events. I was mentioning the Auburn game a moment ago. Want to remind you to make sure you are with us this upcoming Tuesday. That's next week. We're going to be at Marlowe's in Roswell, getting ready for our DawgNation big game preview of the Auburn game, 6 to 8 p.m. We had a blast the last time in Brookhaven. I think we think Roswell's going to be a ton of fun, too. Jeff and I doing one of those sort of special off-air conversations. We'll talk some recruiting with you there. We'll also talk about just, the path to the playoff for the Georgia Bulldogs. It's actually going to be a much more intense conversation this upcoming Tuesday, given where both Georgia and Auburn are ranked and kind of Alabama lurking there. That's going to be a lot of fun. It's Tuesday, Marlowe's in Roswell from 6 until 8 p.m. All right, we got a busy show. It's former Georgia quarterback David Green later on. David's stuff on DawgNation Daily as of late has just been fabulous, and I'm looking forward to having him on today. I mean, such a good perspective from him because he played at Georgia. He can talk about how much his teams paid attention to their ranking. They had some lofty ones. Georgia's got one right now. That'll be good with David Green. We'll kind of get a big picture perspective from Mike Johnson here, also coming up in a moment. And we'll find out how Mike, the Alabama alumnus, feels about seeing his team ranked below the Georgia Bulldogs. That should be kind of a lot of fun coming up in just a moment here on DawgNation Daily. Before any of that, though, let me ask you a serious question. Why does this stuff keep happening to Georgia? And what I mean is, we just had a whole conversation about Georgia being the number one team in the country. And if you look at the stats for Georgia, they're winning their SEC games by, I don't even know, 30 points or something like that. They're blowing everybody out. They will go on the road. They beat a number 3 team in the country, Notre Dame. You'd think that most people would think Georgia's pretty good. And yet, every single week, somebody's talking some trash about how good Georgia isn't and what Georgia can't do and why Georgia's nothing to worry about. Why does this happen to Georgia every single week? I mean, it's not like they're New Mexico State. I mean, this is actually a team that's been pretty good thus far this season. Latest example of this comes from Chris Lamons, a South Carolina defensive back, who was asked this week, hey, which phase of the Georgia offense are you the most worried about? And Lamons didn't mince words about his answer. Here is the South Carolina defensive back.
Which phase of Georgia's offense provides the greater concern, the pass or the run?
The run.
What's the circumstance?
They can't pass.
I mean, what is going on there? Why do these people keep saying this about Jake Fromm? I mean, I swear to you, he's having a good year. And I don't know, what Lamons is thinking there because Georgia runs for 9 yards a carry. Does he assume, or whatever I'm not sure what the exact stat is. It certainly seems about that much. Because Georgia's just, gashing people in the running game. Does he think that means that Jake Fromm is somehow incapable as a quarterback? That'd be like saying because Justin Verlander's dating or married to Kate Upton, he probably couldn't get any other girl besides that. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. Because Georgia runs it so well, they can't pass. Yet we've talked about the fact that Fromm's leading the SEC in yards per attempt, the stat that I think matters more than any other. Many of you shared with me on social media last night that I guess Fromm is leading the SEC in completion percentages for passes like 20 yards down the field. I mean, what is going on here with the misevaluation of Jake Fromm? And we had Oliver Conley on the show yesterday. Ollie did some deep dive into the stats about, from the X's and O's standpoint, and this is a little bit, sort of football X's and O's, but, I mean, Conley laid on the show yesterday just how good of a freshman season he thinks Jake Fromm's having.
I've been just mightily impressed with some of the nuances of Fromm's game from within the pocket. I just didn't think a player of his age would get there. Usually if they're dropping, they stare down at the rush, their feet get tangled up, they don't tie their eyes to their feet. That's a gigantic thing with these young players. And again, you see Fromm executing perfectly the stick, slide, climb, throw. And it's pretty advanced for a young player.
Listen, I mean, it'd be one thing for me to come on DawgNation Daily and say I think that Jake Fromm is advanced for a freshman. Y'all might say, well, Brandon's just got a bias. BA's just, filling his role as the host of DawgNation Daily. And that may be true if I were to say that. But Ollie Conley's from, like, England or something. And he doesn't, cover just Georgia. He covers all of football, not just even college football, NFL too. That's not a guy that writes for DawgNation.com all the time. He wrote a thing about Jake Fromm. We put it on DawgNation.com. That's an objective observer saying, I am blown away by how advanced Jake Fromm is as a freshman. You got this, Lammons guy from South Carolina saying that Georgia can't pass. Now, the good news for Lammons is he's not going to be proven wrong on this because Georgia's going to keep running the ball, right up the gut for, 1,000,000 yards on Saturday. I just think it's funny that people keep saying these things about the Georgia Bulldogs. Nonetheless, it's good to have you with us on DawgNation Daily. We'll have David Green later on. It wouldn't be a Wednesday, though, without Mike Johnson, my partner from AT&T SEC Country Live. Hope you enjoy that right now. And let's say hello to him. He is the co-host with me on AT&T's SEC Country Live each and every afternoon on the SEC Country Facebook page. It's Mike Johnson here on DawgNation Daily. And, Mike, let me say good morning to you. Thanks for being a part of the program. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, man, and congratulations to all the Dog fans out there, ranked number 1 in that college football playoff.
No, don't even start that. Don't even start that. No, don't start trying to play these mind games. Now, first of all, I'm going to tell you, I don't mind being number 1. I don't mind having the target on my back. Of course, I don't have to go on the field and deal with it. But I said before you came on, I don't mind Georgia being number 1, but it's so obvious what you're trying to do here.
Oh, no. Listen, I feel great about it. I picked Georgia before the year started in the SEC. So did you. Yep. And right now our picks are looking golden.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Both Georgia's looking good. Of course, you picked Alabama. I did not. But for now, Georgia's every bit as good as anybody could have thought they were going to be at the beginning of the season. But on a serious note, let me ask you, I mean, what did you think about the decision by the committee last night? I guess you and I this week both thought that Georgia had a chance to be number 1. Now, it's one thing to say they should be there. It's another thing to sort of predict what the committee is going to do. Mine was more of a prediction about the committee's behavior than it was an emphatic statement that Georgia's the best team in the country right now. But, I mean, what were your thoughts about the rationale given by Kirby Hocutt, just the idea that through these first 8 games, Georgia has looked better than Alabama?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of merit to it. Obviously yesterday on the show, I thought that maybe there was a chance that Alabama would be picked number 1 just because they had been number 1 through a lot of the polls throughout the season. But, I mean, I think it's fine. When you match up the records side by side and you look at the victory over Notre Dame being a bigger deal than the victory over Florida State right now, then I understand it. It's like I told you yesterday. I mean, this is something the committee has been known to do. When they know something will play itself out in the end, they have no problem with front-loading this as an SEC type of college football playoff poll right now. They know that these two teams eventually will have to face off against each other. I thought the one thing that I kind of drew from last night's presentation of the top 4 was that there's a better shot now than there ever has been at 2 SEC teams actually getting into the college football playoff. I think that's kind of the way things played out. I think that if you are going to have a number 1 versus number 2 potentially, if these two teams can keep winning out in the SEC championship game in Atlanta, then it's going to be hard to kind of pluck and pull and push when it comes to breaking down their records at the end of the year. It's going to be a very tough decision for the committee to make if you have that 1 versus 2 game. And so that was my biggest takeaway. I know that there were some Alabama fans that wondered why they were number 2, and there was a lot of Georgia fans that were happy or questionable about being number 1. And I think it's fair to question either way. But the beautiful thing about it is the committee knows it'll play itself out in the end.
I actually want to talk to you about that very point that you just brought up here in a moment. Let me first, though, remind folks that DawgNation Daily brought to you in part today by Georgia United Credit Union and the all-new Unified Checking Account, which gives you the comforts of a free checking account with the options to earn more. A simple, convenient, rewarding checking account that fits your lifestyle. Visit GUCU.org for the terms and conditions that apply to this account, federally insured by NCUA. So I guess the only thing I would question about what you just said about the possibility of 2 SEC teams getting the playoff, do you in any way feel concerned that the committee kind of dinging Alabama's work through the first 8 games if it were to be Alabama that lost the SEC championship game, that a one-loss Alabama might be looked upon less favorably than theoretically a one-loss Georgia would be. I mean, for instance, Booger McFarland on ESPN last night said that he thought that a one-loss non-SEC champion Alabama might not get into the playoff, that they needed the SEC championship to get into the playoff. Do you think that Alabama would be viewed less favorably as an SEC runner-up than Georgia would be?
Well, I think it's tough. I think it's all depending on who you're kind of, putting them against. If you're going to put them against Clemson and you're going to tell me that, Alabama's got a worse loss in the SEC championship game against the number one team in the country than Clemson does on the road against Syracuse on a Friday night, then, I think it's a tough pill to swallow. And I know the conference champion thing has been a big deal, but then again, you have Notre Dame sitting there at number 3 who won't have the ability to play in a game like that. And so I think it's going to be all about how this plays out. I think that, the ability that Alabama has shown in recent years, maybe you shouldn't bring that into your decision-making, but I think it's going to be hard to do for you to kind of look away at a 12-1 Alabama team if they did lose to Georgia. So there's a lot of things left to be played out. It's all going to depend on who's sitting there in the number 4 and number 3 holes after that game is played. But Alabama's got some tough tasks coming up. I think SEC Country put out the SEC teams that were in the top 25 this past weekend, and I said on Twitter it reads like a roadmap for Alabama to really try to get their playoff hopes together. LSU's ranked right now, Mississippi State's ranked right now, and Auburn's ranked right now, and then Georgia obviously being ranked if they get to Atlanta. So those 4 teams right there, other than Alabama that are ranked in the SEC, Alabama would still have to play all 4 of those teams. So the strength of schedule will look a lot better in the end for Alabama and Georgia as well after that Auburn game, and you just have to pay attention to who's all going to be surrounding them in the top 4 at the end of the year.
Thought that Auburn was one of the real big winners last night at number 14. The committee sort of looking upon them as the best 2-loss team in America. Do you agree with me that Auburn, whether deserving or not, looks like a pretty big winner from the committee last night?
I definitely think they do, and I think they've definitely been helped by LSU's ability to kind of turn things around after that Troy game. LSU's got 2 losses, and they're a ranked team now. I think if they had really fallen off the table, similar to what Florida State has done after Alabama beat them, then I think you'd look at that and maybe think that wasn't as good of a loss, I guess, as you would want it to be. As far as 2 losses go nationally, I kind of look at Iowa State. I mean, they're a good team. They've beaten 2 top 5 teams. They're going to have the opportunity to try to do some good things later in the year as well this year. And there are some powerful 2-loss teams out there. I don't think you can look away from any of those teams as being guys that couldn't have the ability to jump into that top 4 or 5 or 6 towards the end of the year. But Auburn's definitely one of them. I mean, the roadmap is still there for Auburn to climb back into this thing, and they have shown the ability to beat some good football teams. So I think they were definitely winners last night when you look at those 2-loss teams in the poll.
But and I want to get to the LSU thing in a minute, but when you look at, Auburn ranked ahead of LSU, when you look at Auburn getting some more favor than some other 2-loss teams may have gotten, I mean, at this point, now I made the case for Auburn before the start of the season. I still think this is a very talented team. I obviously very impressed with the Auburn defense. But when you look at the results on the field, I mean, what is the game that you circle and point to? Is it anything else other than the Mississippi State game? I mean, Auburn obviously looked very strong against Mississippi State, much the same way that Georgia did. I mean, is the entire case for Auburn made on the back of this team clobbered Mississippi State?
Possibly, and I think it's also the one-score loss to Clemson that looks not too bad right now when you look at what Clemson's been able to do. I think that when you start to measure those losses up against each other, obviously Auburn takes a loss against LSU in a very tight game, but then you look at the other loss, and they lost to Clemson by a touchdown, and LSU lost to Troy at home by a touchdown. And so I think when you start to measure those things up, although they have the same amount of losses, it really is hard to put the head-to-head into consideration when you talk about those 2 teams. LSU's done a great job of fighting back. But Auburn's played a tough schedule throughout the season, and I think that you're going to see the committee start to continue to look at things like that as we move forward.
Yeah, and on the LSU thing here for a moment, I mean, it's one thing when a head-to-head, matchup maybe tells you something that you didn't expect to see. For instance, if Oklahoma and Ohio State played again, my assumption is Ohio State will win that game. I think Ohio State's better than Oklahoma, even though Oklahoma won the time they played head-to-head. With Auburn and LSU, I'm not so sure. LSU beat Auburn head-to-head, and I saw Auburn with its offense on the field in the fourth quarter with chances to win that game and really unable to do it. Given the fact that, I thought that LSU got a solid, fair, and square win against Auburn, is it fair for the committee to rank LSU so far below Auburn? Yes, I know the Tigers, at least the Baton Rouge version, lost to Troy, but were you surprised that the committee put a gap between Auburn and LSU?
I wasn't that surprised, honestly. I mean, I commend, like I said, I commend LSU for the turnarounds they've had, but we can't look away from what they looked like early on in the year. I mean, actually, the Syracuse win they had, I think they won by 9 points, actually looks a lot better now when you look back at it than you thought at the time. But still, I see the gap being there. This is not a good Troy team. I think when you look at that and say, oh man, was that a good Troy team? Have they been beating everybody else in their conference and the games they've been playing? They turned around the next week and lost to South Alabama by a couple of touchdowns. And so I think you really have to weigh that loss differently. Like I said, I commend LSU and their players and whatever they had to turn to down there to get their season turned around, but it's just an extremely tough loss to look past when you start measuring them against some of the other two-loss teams. That Auburn loss against LSU, I kind of look at it maybe opposite of you. I think that if they played that game again, Auburn would clobber LSU. I feel that way, similar to what you feel about Ohio State and Oklahoma. I think that Auburn just took their foot off the gas in the second half and thought they had it in the bag, and it ended up biting them in the butt.
Of course, one way or another, Auburn would have to do any of this for the remainder of the season without Cameron Petway, the running back, whose season came to an end based on an announcement, or at least going to be out for a long time based on the announcement that came out yesterday. Let me go back to something else we were talking about before you joined us, and that's what South Carolina defensive back Chris Lamon said about Jake Fromm. Another one of these teams kind of talking trash about Georgia, talking trash about Fromm. It didn't work last week for Chauncey Gardner in Florida. It didn't work for Jonathan Abram earlier in the season against Mississippi State. And now Lamon's kind of goes back down that road saying he's way more worried about the Georgia running game because Georgia, quote, can't pass. Why do teams keep saying this about Georgia? They're winning their games by 30 points.
Well, hey, B.A., this is poetic justice for me talking to you. All the questions we've had about Jalen Hurts all offseason and, his inability to pass. They're not asked to. And I think that gives you a bad frame of reference when you look at either one of those offenses that these guys aren't really asked to pass that much. And so I think that when you look at it, you have to pick what a team strength's going to be. And that's what the best coaches do in the SEC. They pick a team strength and they try to keep them from doing it. And that's what you're going to see South Carolina try to do this weekend. Load the box and force Jake Fromm to pass. But I think he's shown plenty of ability to put the ball on the numbers throughout the year and to hit some of his wide receivers and allow them to make explosive plays. I know that his total yardage isn't up there with some of the other quarterbacks in the SEC, but it doesn't need to be. I mean, when you look at the total yardage numbers and the guys who are passing for the ton of yards in the SEC, their teams aren't very good. I mean, you're talking about Mizzou and you're talking about Arkansas and you're talking about Ole Miss. So, the teams are going to continue to question him. He's only had one 300-yard passing game, I believe, but the good news for South Carolina and their defensive backs is I don't think Jay Fromm is going to have to pass the ball this weekend. I know that South Carolina's got a defensive front that has come a long way this year with a lot of young talent, but that Georgia rushing attack right now is undefeated, obviously, and I think they're going to be able to continue to do the same things that have made them successful. I don't think you're going to ask Jake Fromm to do a ton this weekend, and so that's probably good news for those cornerbacks out there, because I don't think anybody will be able to demonstrate that their words weren't true.
Terry Crews in the comments section said when it comes to Fromm, they see him walking on water and they say, yeah, but he can't swim. And that's kind of the feeling I get there as well. You see DeAndre Swift and Sony Michel and Nick Chubb, just churning them, million yards a game, and you say, well, that must mean they can't pass at all. I mean, it really is kind of strange. And as you said, the way to compile total passing yards is to be down by 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. That's why teams like Mississippi and Missouri are compiling those yards because they're coming back and playing from deficit.
Yeah, listen, this was the same talking point. My entire senior year at Alabama was, Greg McElroy can't pass the ball, and he did have some struggles, did have some turnovers. We had a Heisman Trophy-winning running back. Trent Richardson was our backup running back that year, and we ran through a lot of teams. We had a lot of rushing yards, and so it wasn't until later in the year, really a 2-minute drill against Auburn in the Iron Bowl, and being able to really come out and pass for some yardage against Florida in the SEC title game, that people really respected Greg McElroy as a quarterback. I think that you're seeing the same thing is coming out of Athens right now, where Jake Fromm isn't asked to do it, but I think that he'll answer the bell when he is. I think he's accurate enough and knows the offense well enough now, midway through his freshman year, to where that he can answer the bell when he needs to. And you're just going to continue to get those questions. People are going to question anybody that isn't up there in numbers, and there's always going to be something to point to when you look at teams like that. But he'll have his chance to shine. I have no doubt that Georgia will continue to be able to, a strong running team, and they'll probably march that running game right into the SEC title game, and hopefully Jake Fromm be able to answer the bell. And
the last guy that said something about Jake Fromm got toted off the field during the game when they played. So we'll see what happens to Lamons on Saturday for South Carolina. Speaking of Florida, What do you think about this coaching search thus far? You know, we've talked about this a bunch. Who can remember what anybody says? Do you have a favorite for the Florida coaching job right now? The guy that you think deserves the job more than any other?
I don't know if this guy will get the job, and I don't know if they'll even look at him. But Campbell from Iowa State right now, to me, is just a perfect fit. He doesn't have any ties to Florida. He's not like a guy like Dan Mullen who's been in the SEC and has been semi-successful. When you look offensively at what Iowa State has been able to do with really a third-string quarterback, a guy who's on his fourth college, that's what you want in a head coach down in Florida right now, somebody that can bring these quarterbacks along. He's been at Toledo as a head coach and done great things offensively. He's been at Iowa State now this year and done great things offensively, and I think that's something Florida needs to find. I know that all the whispers out there have been about Mike Norvell at Memphis and Scott Frost at UCF, and obviously Dan Mullen with the ties to Scott Strickland. But I don't know if any of those are home run hires. I think that Mike Norvell will probably be better suited going to Tennessee. I think that Scott Frost at some point will end up landing at Nebraska, the place he went to college. And so I look at a guy like Campbell, sitting over there in the Big 12 who would love to make a move down to Florida. And I think he's very, very well suited for what Florida needs in a head coach right now.
Listen, I think you would agree with me. This is a really fun time of year to be talking about college football, whether it be coaching changes, whether it be, a lot of recruiting wins for these SEC teams, moving towards a whole handful, including Georgia in the college football playoff conversation. A great, great day to do AT&T SEC Country Live. I'm looking forward to doing it with you this afternoon. We'll talk about all this stuff, and Georgia's obviously going to be a big part of that. Mike, thanks for your time here on DawgNation Daily, and we'll look forward to seeing you this afternoon.
Listen, man, November is going to be a very, very fun month for a lot of these college football programs. I look forward to talking it with you every day. Looking forward to today as well.
Good stuff, Mike.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Good stuff there from Mike Johnson. We'll see him this afternoon. AT&T SEC Country Live on the SEC Country Facebook page. It starts at 3 p.m. Eastern Time as we get ready to transition to our SEC Through. Let me remind you that DawgNation Daily today brought to you in part by our friends at MyBookie. And, when you think about holiday cash, you need it. And I know where you can get some. It's at MyBookie, the place to score serious cash on your sports predictions. Hard to believe, but the holidays are actually just around the corner. Well, that means plenty of parties, gifts, and spending. It also means there's a lot of football, basketball, even hockey you can score big on every day. Man up and play like the pros. You can play the money line, the side, or the total. MyBookie's your hookup for all your betting needs. Offers the fast payout when you win. That's why you want to trust MyBookie. You can check them out online at mybookie.ag. Enter the promo code DawgNation. That's DAWG. Your first deposit will be matched up to 50%. That's at mybookie.ag. Enter the promo code DawgNation. You play, you win, you get paid. All right, let's talk about our SEC teams in the college football playoff top 25. Where was Georgia ranked again? Oh, yeah, that's right. Number 1 in the country. The very top of the list of the Georgia Bulldogs. Below that, you do have Alabama at 2. You got Auburn at 14. Mississippi State at 16 and LSU at 19. And the interesting conversation that Mike and I were having a moment ago is kind of how you compare Auburn and LSU. I was very high on Auburn at the beginning of the season. I thought that would clearly be Georgia's toughest game this year. As it turns out, that is indeed going to be true, at least in terms of regular season games. But when you think about the distance the committee's putting between it right now and LSU, a team that beat Auburn, there is a part of me that doesn't quite understand all of that. I mean, yes, I know Auburn lost to Clemson and LSU lost to Troy. I do get that. But, LSU still beat Auburn, and LSU's got its chance against Alabama on Saturday. Now, if you had to tell me which of these two teams are most likely to beat Alabama, I would still say Auburn's the more likely to get the win against the Crimson Tide. But it is kind of interesting here that the committee favors Auburn so much more over LSU. Let me also mention Mississippi State here for a moment, because Mississippi State's sliding in at 16. And by the way, Bulldogs did a great job of kind of going and getting a pretty significant road win against Texas A&M on Saturday, earning that number 16 ranking. And as y'all know, I know you're very much aware of this, that spot that Mississippi State occupies really helps Georgia. To have beaten the number 16 team in the country as badly as Georgia beat Mississippi State just bolsters the Georgia resume. Same thing for the win against number 3 Notre Dame. Georgia very much helped right now by the really good season that Mississippi State is having. And obviously, as Kirby Hocutt said earlier in our show, that comparison between Alabama and Georgia is going to be ongoing. And for now, at least, I think the committee got this right. Okay, so I want to make a case for something. And I know that y'all are going to think that I'm being idiotic about this, and maybe I am. But I at least want you to understand where this comes from. Obviously, I want Florida to hire the worst coach it possibly can. I've never pretended to be objective about that. I'm not, serious capital J journalist when it comes to that kind of stuff. I do the show from the perspective of a fan, and I'm the kind of fan that wants to see Florida suffer. So I want Florida to hire a bad coach. But let's say for a moment I didn't want that. Let's say for a moment I was objectively viewing who Florida should hire, who would be the best choice for the Florida Gators. Here's the thing. You'd want a guy that has experience as a head coach. Experienced head coaches outperform inexperienced coaches on average when all things are equal. You'd want a guy that has proven that he could recruit. The guy I'm thinking about has. You'd want a guy that was duplicating from a mentality the same thing that Nick Saban's doing at Alabama, that Kirby Smart is doing at Georgia. I mean, that'd be the perfect picture, the perfect composite of who Florida should be looking for as its coach, right? I mean, if you could get all those things, you'd feel like you had the best hire you could possibly get. Shouldn't Florida rehire Will Muschamp? Now, I know how dumb that's going to sound, and I'm sure you're shouting at your device right now about me just saying this just to be dumb on. The truth is, I guess I'm partially kidding because I wouldn't imagine this could ever happen, but there was some talk the other day about Tennessee rehiring Lane Kiffin, and I don't think Lane Kiffin's anywhere near the head coaching candidate Will Muschamp is. I mean, Muschamp's winning at South Carolina. He's recruiting at South Carolina. When he was at Florida, he was putting top 5 classes together. I mean, Jim McElwain barely cracked the top 20. He did not crack the top 20 in 2015, missed the top 10 in 2016 and 2017. Muschamp is such a better recruiter than Jim McElwain. I know it would never happen, but I think that's the best hire that Florida could make, and we'll make that your SEC through. And now we'll get ready to transition over and get ready to talk to the former Georgia quarterback, David Green. Of course, when David comes on, we have a lot of fun talking about the current state of the Georgia Bulldogs, and we'll also talk about a big autograph signing as well that takes place at Tailgate Apparel this Saturday before the Dogs take on Will Muschamp's South Carolina Gamecocks. Let me say good morning and welcome David Green back to DawgNation Daily. David, how you doing today? All right, we'll get David coming up in just a moment. We have David ready to go. David, how you doing today?
Brandon, doing good. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing really well. It's good to have you on the program. And I got to ask you, you're not just a former Georgia player, a UGA alumnus. You're also a longtime follower of the program. I think it's safe to say you're a big Georgia fan. As a guy that was tuned in last night, how did it feel for you to see that Georgia logo show up next to the number 1 as the top team in the country according to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee?
Well, I tell you what, it certainly made me proud. It's good to see on a national level that I think Georgia's getting the respect that we deserve. I think in years past, it was always one. Everybody's, well, Georgia's going to flop. People, I think, at this point really know that this team is legit, a serious contender. As a player and even a fan, I really wouldn't mind seeing us stay in the number 2 slot because these polls really don't matter.
Sure.
Right now, but then again, Brandon, I think it does. We're going to find out a lot about the maturity of this team because playing the number 1 spot, I mean, there's certainly a spotlight on you, and hopefully, the guys playing with it this weekend will be able to just concentrate on their business. And Kirby talks about, just keep chopping, and if they can just keep executing, keep their head down, and just play ball like they've been doing, they should be fine.
And I want to ask you about that in particular. Obviously, so many fans are going to use the phrase you just used of keep chopping that wood and head down, stay focused. I think this team has been incredibly good at that, the best that I can tell. But you're a guy that actually lived through this. Your 2002 team, I believe, was ranked in the top 10 every single week of the season. Very high ranking by the end of the year. So you know what it's like to kind of live with sort of a lofty number next to your name. Were you aware of that? Did the team know that? I mean, the coaches will say, hey, block that stuff out, but players ignore coaches' instructions all the time. I mean, how much were y'all aware of, especially in 2002, the fact that you were kind of, a single-digit number next to your name for most of the year?
We were certainly aware of it, but I'll be honest with you, that year was special. I mean, the confidence that we had as a team, it was a very, calm feeling, though. I mean, we were extremely hungry. We were extremely focused. We knew our strengths and weaknesses, and we played together as a team. And when you got a close group of guys that are willing to play for each other, that know that you've got enough respect for your opponent where you know you got to bring your A game every week. And if we don't, we got a chance of all of our hard work we've done to this point go away. And so I think if you can have that healthy dose of I'm going to respect my opponent, but at the same time I got a lot of confidence and I love my team and my brothers, that's really where you want. You don't need to be the guy that, searching your own name on Twitter, seeing what everybody's saying about you and the DawgNation. I mean, you got to quit worrying about that because that's the kind of stuff, as the coaches say, the rat poison, and you start drinking that juice, you're going down the wrong road.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well said for sure. One of the things I heard from a lot of our audience in the last couple of weeks is, you talking about what the Florida win meant to you when you got it in 2004 and, the disappointment that you had for some of the games that you maybe let it get away against Florida and previous Georgia teams that you may have witnessed. As a fan of this program, as a guy who won a game against Florida and knows the importance of this series, how much did Saturday mean to you to see 42-7 against those Gators? It had to be a special time for you, right?
Well, and the thing that I love about this team is, I've seen previous teams and even teams where I were all, have some success in the SEC, but I haven't seen a Georgia team dominate to where a team, really where you just make another team want to quit. And, that's essentially what happened. I mean, I was actually at a flag football game for my son at the beginning of the game, and next thing I'm getting text 7-0, 14-0, then 21-0. I thought it was a joke to begin with, but it was incredible, and it was actually funny because we were riding home from the game, and my oldest son goes, "Man, Dad, I kind of feel bad for Florida." And I said, "Oh no, son, never feel bad. We got to keep the pedal down. I want this thing in the 60s if we can get there."
That's what I call raising them right there, David. That's
right.
Taking the wisdom of the ancients and passing it down to the next generation. I like that.
That's exactly right.
Hey, let me finish up with this. You've obviously got a big event coming up on Saturday, the autograph signing for Lindsey Scott. Speaking of beating Florida, obviously Lindsey was a huge part of that win in 1980 against the Gators. And he's going to be at Tailgate Apparel. And now we love Tailgate because they got that great sort of old-school UGA apparel. It's right there, 279 East Broad Street in Athens, Georgia. It's a great place to be. Just really anytime you're shopping for some UGA gear, but also this Saturday for a chance to get to meet the legendary Lindsey Scott from the Run Lindsey Run 1980 game. Tell us a little bit more about what's going to go down this Saturday.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I think the weather is going to be beautiful. And to begin with, obviously, I think Athens is going to be rocking Saturday. So many folks are excited about the way the Dogs are playing. So certainly come by. Lindsey Scott, one of the great all-time legends at Georgia, is going to be at tailgate from 12:30 to 2:30. And I'll tell you what the neat story is we just actually found Lindsey. He was walking in the store one day. I was like, "Man, this stuff is awesome. I would love to be a part of it." And our store manager, Chantel, called me and said, "Hey, Lindsey Scott was in the store today." And so I called up Lindsey and said, "Man, Lindsey, we would love to have you sign because we know there's awesome. So many Dog fans. They would love to be able to chance to say hello and get to see him and the whole deal." So he's going to be in town. He's coming up from Valdosta for the game, so we're excited to have him.
Hey, David, that's a great story. Looking forward to Saturday. Going to be a lot of fun. Thanks for your time here on DawgNation Daily. Hope you continue to enjoy this ride for the Dogs, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Sounds good, Brandon. Thank you, buddy.
Good stuff there from David Green. How about that story about Lindsey Scott? Just kind of a humble, unassuming guy. I met Lindsey a couple years ago at a golf tournament, and super guy, super nice guy. And one of the real thrills for me was I know Buck Ballou a little bit, and Buck was there. He threw the touchdown to Lindsey Scott. Lindsey was there. I sort of pulled both of them in close and kind of got my picture with both of them at the same time. Just really thinking back to that great 1980 game. And it's going to be really awesome to see Lindsey Scott signing autographs, Tailgate Apparel in Athens on Saturday. That's the old Harry Bissett's building in downtown Athens, if you're curious about that. To close out our show today, I thought that Seth Emerson had a really good piece at DawgNation.com this week, kind of looking at why the Georgia offensive line is different this year and why the results are better for the Dogs when it comes to the running game. I thought Chad Peltier on Twitter, who has done some analytics work, had some interesting work on that, compared Georgia this year, 20th according to one advanced stat in terms of the rushing attack, from 82nd last year. A huge example of how much the Dogs have improved. We'll see you tomorrow on DawgNation Daily. And for those of you who are here with us right now, you want to talk about some stuff on the show, we'll give you a chance to do anything you want from today's show, whether it be the number one ranking, what the South Carolina defensive back had to say, any of the stuff from the SEC in the playoffs last night. We can do all of that with you. Jason Daniel says that David Green's a DGD. I would certainly agree with that. No question about that. David's a lot of fun to have on the program. Just a guy that, first of all, he was very, very good at Georgia. You know, some of you are a little young, maybe you don't remember the 2002 team. You know, the poise that David showed at quarterback during his career was really just incredible. And as a young guy myself, and you see now, you know, you feel like you don't have any free time now. And I'm not whining. I'm not, you know, complaining. I love my life. I have the world's greatest life. But there's not a lot of extra free time to sort of do whatever you want. Back in 2002, man, I didn't have anything. It seemed like the Georgia football games, but the only thing that I, you know, had to ever worry about. How am I going to get tickets? How am I going to get to the game? Where's the tailgate going to be? You know, when you're young like that, and I was, you know, sort of early 20s in 2002, when you're young like that, you just get a chance to just sort of just really soak it all in, and it's a little different. You know, now I'm a little more regimented with my schedule. I'm having to squeeze in the playoff selection committee announcement last night on DVR after my kids had finished trick-or-treating, which I wouldn't trade anything for. It's just a different experience now. Back then in 2002, when David was playing, I'm going to all these games, away games too. I'd go 9-10 games a year. Just incredible to kind of have, you know, that free time, that ability to enjoy that. So talking to David always makes me think about how much fun it was way back then when, you know, really my to-do list for the week, like the first 5 items were like getting ready for the next Saturday's football game. It's not quite like that right now. Ryan Green says, how do you feel about Mike Gundy for the Florida job? That would actually scare me a little bit. Yeah, Gundy's a good offensive mind. I mean, I guess that long flowing mullet would fit in right very well in Gainesville. From that standpoint, visually, it seems to be a fit. But, you know, you're going to bring one of these guys in that hasn't done the SEC-style recruiting and say, go to bat against Kirby Smart. I mean, I got news for you. Mike Gundy's teams, and who's a good coach, don't get me wrong, but a Gundy offense against Kirby Smart every year, that team's not going to run the football. It's just not. I mean, y'all think I'm kidding about the Will Muschamp thing, but if Muschamp had not been fired for Florida, that's the kind of guy Florida should hire. And Will Muschamp, with better resources, South Carolina has limited resources, Florida, for the most part, doesn't. That's the kind of guy that scares me for Georgia. You know, I think that Muschamp, to the extent that it's possible, is building something at South Carolina. I saw where Steve Spurrier this week said that he thought that Muschamp ought to get some consideration for SEC Coach of the Year. Now, Kirby Smart, as it stands right now, is the SEC Coach of the Year, but I sort of understand where Spurrier's coming from a little bit, and that Muschamp really is kind of building a program at South Carolina. He's winning some recruiting battles. He's probably going to beat out Georgia for Rick Sandage. Georgia's hosting Sandage on Saturday. They want that defensive tackle from North Carolina. South Carolina's probably going to get him. Now, you can say, well, there's an insinuating circumstance. Sandage's mom went to South Carolina, and I'm sure that really helps there. But come on, I mean, you know, schools beat out legacies all the time. They beat out their other schools for legacies frequently. It's not an impossibility to beat out South Carolina for Sandage because his mom's an alumna. Is that the female version of that? An alumna. It's not impossible to do that, but Muschamp's a good enough recruiter that he's going to sell early playing time. He's going to win that. That's who scares me for Georgia's future. You know, some hotshot, Big 12 offensive type guy, even Scott Frost for the most part, who's a smart guy, but you're changing over the entire offense at Florida if you bring in a Chip Kelly disciple, the Big 12 spread stuff. I'm no X's and O's expert, but y'all know it's a good bit different. These are heavy pass, oriented offense. All those short dink and dunk passes. Not the big offensive lineman, not the ability to sort of dominate with the run. For me, that does not scare me for Georgia going forward because Georgia's just going to keep getting bigger and more talented. It's the kind of coach who might, be able to go head-to-head. I mean, why is Florida not in on Tyson Campbell? If Campbell's leaving South Florida, why is he not going to Gainesville? Because Florida can't recruit right now. Campbell's going to essentially drive past Gainesville, Florida to get to a place like Georgia, maybe. I mean, I'm not telling you Campbell's definitely coming to Georgia, but he's potentially coming to Georgia. And, the University of Florida ought to have an advantage over a Fort Lauderdale kid over UGA, but right now that's not the case. So what scares me in the future, to the extent that anything does, is the kind of coach who changes that. The kind of coach who says, you know what, we're going to go into Georgia, try to get some of those kids, and we're going to try to close the borders as much as it can be with more of the Florida kids. But, Florida hiring an unproven recruiter, I believe, is just ceding more control of the SEC East over to Kirby Smart. Now, I've been wrong before, but that's kind of my opinion on that. Sorry for the long rant on that. Santiago Diarn says, as long as Kirby recruits them elite players, it doesn't matter who Tennessee or Florida hires, unless they were to hire someone who just makes that more difficult. And right now, Jim McElwain was not going to be that guy. McElwain was not going to win a head-to-head battle for a player with Kirby Smart. It just wasn't. You can think about, guys in this recruiting cycle. I mean, and let's be honest here, a lot of those players that were sort of going towards Florida were maybe players that Georgia didn't prioritize. I can think of a couple in particular. Benjamin Cruz says, talk about Owen Popo. I think Popo is such an interesting name for Georgia. Obviously, Popo's top 3 comes out this week. Georgia included in that. I think that Popo is an example of just how much recruiting momentum Georgia's built with the class of 2019. I mean, there was some talk at one point, I think, of Georgia being able to put an elite 2019 class together that did not include Popo, because Popo wasn't trending Georgia for a while. But now it obviously looks like that he is, and I think the ways in which Georgia can use Popo are really kind of interesting here too. Because right now from a high school standpoint, you think about Popo being an outside linebacker, but Georgia's going to bring in Adam Anderson for this class. They might bring in KJ Henry for this class. You got Nolan Smith for the class of 2019. Can you use Popo in a different way? Can you use Popo as more of a middle linebacker, kind of a Roquan Smith style player? Think about the way that Alabama's used Rashaan Evans. I've said before, I've used to do a lot of high school football games on TV. One of the best high school players I ever saw was Rashaan Evans at Auburn High School. That's a big-time high school pass rusher who, at least for a lot of the time, Alabama is kind of used as an interior linebacker. Would Georgia consider doing the same thing with Popo? I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. I know Jeff Sintel's kind of talked about some of that as well. Arlen Block says, shocked to see Nebraska on Popo's top 3. Yeah, I don't quite know what to make about that either. I mean, go spend one day in the winter in Lincoln and see if you still want to go to Nebraska. Derek Thomas says, I believe Georgia gets in even with one loss, depending on where it comes. Do you agree? I do think, and listen, let me first of all preface this. I think that Georgia fans who get frustrated with the way that people assume that Alabama is going to beat Georgia in the SEC championship game have every right to be irritated by that. This notion that it's sort of a understood talking point of, well, what if Georgia loses close to Alabama? And the Georgia fan wants to say back, well, what if Alabama loses close to Georgia? Because while Alabama would be the favorite, as Schleybaugh tweeted from ESPN yesterday or over the weekend, right now Alabama, according to at least one online sports book, only a 6-point favorite over Georgia. Let's not act like Alabama's a 3-touchdown favorite over UGA. That's just not the case right now. But since you brought up the hypothetical, I'll kind of go there. I think it seems a little more likely that one-loss Georgia would be a second SEC team in the playoff than one-loss Alabama. Because, I mean, Alabama is just not going to have a lot of those credential-building wins. LSU this week, the committee told you that's just the 19th best team in the country. An Alabama loss, they may drop out of the polls altogether. That's not a top 25 win from the committee's perspective at the end of the year. Alabama would have a win against Auburn, but Georgia would have that same win against Auburn. And what else would Alabama have besides that Auburn win? I guess you'd add a Mississippi State win in that as well. But there are going to be some teams that have more wins than that. Clemson's going to have more than that. The Big Ten representative's going to have more than that. Notre Dame's going to have more than that. I think that Georgia, were it to be a one-loss team at the after the championship game, would be better suited for the playoff than Alabama. Now, the caveat to this is Nick Saban's such a big name. Alabama represents such a big brand. Would the committee sort of give a little bit? Now, they'd never admit this. They would not say this, publicly. But would they give a nod towards Alabama just because of the name brand status that they bring to the table? The comparison I made before is, for those of you who are as old as me, you remember back in boxing when Mike Tyson wasn't the champion for a long time, but when he was boxing, he was still the biggest name in the sport, and it was almost it was a bigger deal to knock out Mike Tyson or beat Mike Tyson than it would have been to be the heavyweight champion of the world. There's an element of that's true when it comes to Alabama. They're not the defending national champion, but nobody says, hey, we want Clemson, bring on Clemson. They are the defending champions, but nobody ever says that. People say, we want Bama. And with all due respect, Georgia's currently ranked number 1, but when these teams sort of, mockingly, challenge somebody, they're not going to challenge, Georgia. The we want Bama sort of idea, the meme, isn't going to go away just because Alabama's not ranked number 1. So that may be kind of a secret, under-the-table reason why Alabama kind of slides in there. Starkville Aquarium says the committee gave a nod to Brand last year by putting Ohio State in. I agree. I think they actually did that twice with Ohio State. I think the same thing was true in 2014 as well. TCU and Baylor, for those of you who remember back to 2014, those two Big 12 teams that had been in a conversation all year, had been in that sort of top 4 range all year. At the end, when it was all said and done, they went down, Ohio State went up. The committee's not going to make a decision that's bad for business. They're not going to put one of these sort of lower-tier teams in the playoff. Now, there'll be some years when it's sort of impossible to ignore somebody. That may have been true for Oregon in 2014. They'd also been on the national stage enough that people kind of recognized them. But some years they're going to have to put somebody in, and they're going to try not to go too many years, I believe, with excluding a conference. For instance, it's sort of like the Big 12 and the Pac-12 that kind of take turns being in the playoff. They won't leave one conference out too many consecutive years, I don't believe. As Starkville Aquarium pointed out, there is a consideration for brand when it comes to playoff. You have to acknowledge that. Now, the good news is Georgia is very close to a major media market like Atlanta. There are millions of Georgia fans. If it comes down to a brand equation, Georgia should factor pretty well into that discussion, assuming there's not another Southern team right there side by side. Jerry Lewis says something that everybody can agree with. We're not the top dogs until we beat Bama. Saban, 12-0 against former assistants. To be the man, you got to beat the man. So once said a wise man, and y'all know I know who that wise man was. It was the nature boy Ric Flair, and that is true. That Georgia does not have bragging rights as the number 1 team in the country until it earns those bragging rights against Alabama. That's just true. You have to beat Alabama to validate your number 1 ranking. That's what Clemson's deal was about in last year. Not only did it win the national championship, it did so by having beaten Alabama. In 2014, Ohio State won the national championship. Now, it beat Oregon to get there, but the semifinal game was a game that was won by, Ohio State over Alabama. That was the validation of Ohio State, not the game against Oregon. It was the game against Alabama. So what Jerry says there is true, that it's the victory against Alabama that proves you are number 1. The committee can give you the number 1 ranking, but they can't make you, truly the best until you beat the team that's viewed the best. I think that's actually a pretty good point. Santiago Diarn likes the Nature Boy reference. I do too. Brandon Pratt says Saban has not won a national championship without Kirby Smart. That's important to know. I think that's a good point there as well. Alan Verbanchik says, remember, being ranked number 1 will help UGA stay in the playoff hunt if they were to lose a close one to Alabama. I don't think they would drop more than 3 spots. So the committee, though, is kind of a weird thing. I mean, if you look at the past history of the committee, there's a lot of change from week to week. And some of that change is not necessarily predicated on predictable reasons. The 2014 end-of-season poll is an example of that when, a lot of the sites were sort of treating it as a foregone conclusion that TCU was going to earn that spot ahead of Ohio State, and the committee just flat out, dropped TCU, even though TCU had won at the end of the season. Kind of unusual to see a team drop after a win, but that's what the committee did because it wanted, I believe, Ohio State in there, and it justified that by saying Ohio State was Big Ten champion and TCU was not a conference champion because that year the Big 12 chose to award a tie to both Baylor and TCU. So I think the committee is not predictable, and we may do this some over the course of the next few weeks, showing some contradictions between Kirby Hocutt, what he says one week compared to another. He'll speak every week on behalf of the committee, and his thought process won't always be linear. That's been true now for the last 3 years. It'll be true this year. So I don't think any of us can assume what the committee's going to do. We have a chance of being wrong. But the overall point I do agree with, that there are justifiable reasons why Georgia was rated ahead of Alabama last night. And those same justifiable reasons would become to Georgia's benefit were it to have one loss at the end of this deal. I mean, this is a real conversation now. Georgia's got to keep winning to stay in the discussion, but for now, that's exactly where it is, and I can't wait to talk to y'all more about it. We'll keep this going this afternoon on AT&T SEC Country Live, 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the SEC Country Facebook page. I'd love to have you join us there for that. If you missed a portion of our broadcast, anything from Mike Johnson or David Green, that's going to be the audio version of our show. We'll post that for you at SoundCloud right after the show's over. It actually may even be up right now. And I'll have it on DawgNation.com for you also. And then tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., for another episode of Dawg Nation Daily Live. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll look forward to seeing you then.